What's up, guys? This is Chris from DraftDashboard.com.
Here are my DFS picks for NFL Week 1. Final look.
These picks apply for DraftKings and FanDuel. Before I get started, please drop a like on this video and hit that red subscribe button
And hit that bell icon.
so you don't miss our new videos.
In this video, I'm going to go over each position and break down a couple of my favorite players for this NFL DFS main slate. And if you stick around to the very end of this video, we'll use the Draft Dashboard tools to make a DFS lineup using the picks we just made. Okay guys, NFL Week 1, here's my final look at each position. So at the quarterback position, yes, I like Patrick Mahomes, but he's probably going to be an auto play every single week. He's the most expensive player, or the most expensive quarterback on the slate. He's going to be about 9% owned this week, and they do have a high game total, 54.5 points scored in this game, and they're favored by 5.5. So yes, I like Patrick Mahomes, but if you want to save some salary on this slate and come down on ownership a little bit, take a look at Kyler Murray from the Arizona Cardinals playing the Tennessee Titans, who have the 5th worst defense overall, and they give up the 4th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Kyler Murray averaged 25.4 fantasy points per game on the season last year, and he was getting an average of 8.3 rush attempts per game. He's going to be about 5% owned, projected at 24.1 fantasy points here in Week 1. He's 7,600 DraftKings salary and 800 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 52 points scored in this game, and they have the Cardinals trailing by 3. So I like this pick because this is going to be a fast-paced game. Both teams ranked in the top 10 in pace last year. It's a high game total, and you should get over 8 rush attempts for Kyler Murray. He's in a great matchup, so I think he's one of the best quarterback picks on the slate. So I like Kyler Murray here versus the Tennessee Titans. Now, if you want to save even more salary and come down in ownership even more, take a look at Jalen Hurts from the Philadelphia Eagles playing the Atlanta Falcons, who have the 3rd worst defense overall, and they give up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Jalen Hurts, he scored 17, 25, and 41 fantasy points in his last 3 games last year, and in those games he got 8, 9, and 11 rush attempts. Now he's only going to be about 3% owned, projected at 21.3 fantasy points here in Week 1, and he's only 6,400 DraftKings salary and 1,200 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 48.5 points scored in this game, and they have the Eagles trailing by 3.5. So you got to like the matchup here. Fantastic matchup. He should get a ton of rush attempts, and the Eagles could fall behind in this game. Jalen Hurts might have to do a lot of work. So I like Jalen Hurts here versus the Atlanta Falcons. Another stud quarterback that I like is Josh Allen from the Buffalo Bills playing the Pittsburgh Steelers. Now, the Steelers had a good defense overall last year, and they were good against opposing quarterbacks, but Josh Allen, he averaged 27.3 fantasy points per game on the season last year, getting an average of 6.4 rush attempts per game. He's going to be about 8% owned, projected at 23.7 fantasy points here in Week 1, and he's 7,400 DraftKings salary and 700 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 48.5 points scored in this game, and they have the Bills favored by 6.5. So Josh Allen has a ton of upside in this game with his ability to rush the ball, and he's got a stud wide receiver, a deep ball guy like Stephon Diggs that can put up a ton of yards and touchdowns. So I like Josh Allen here versus the Pittsburgh Steelers. Okay, now if you're looking for like a sleeper pick quarterback, take a look at Jimmy Garoppolo from the San Francisco 49ers playing the Detroit Lions, who had the absolute worst defense overall last year, and they gave up the absolute most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Now, Jimmy Garoppolo only averaged 11.6 fantasy points per game on the season last year. Not very good. He got an average of 1.7 rush attempts per game, and he's going to be under 1% owned. So super low ownership. He's $5,500 DraftKings salary and $1,400 more on FanDuel. He's projected at 18.2 fantasy points here in week 1. And Vegas thinks there's going to be 45 points scored in this game, with the San Francisco 49ers favored by 8. So I like this pick because the low ownership, the low price tag, fantastic matchup couldn't get any better, and the San Francisco 49ers have the third highest team total on the slate of 26.5. So Vegas expects the 49ers to score a lot of points in this game. I think Jimmy Garoppolo will be a big part of that. So I like Jimmy Garoppolo as a sleeper pick here versus the Detroit Lions. Okay, let's take a look at the running back position. So let's get this stud out of the way right off the bat. I like Christian McCaffrey from the Carolina Panthers playing the New York Jets, who had the 4th worst defense overall last year, and they were middle of the pack defending opposing running backs. Christian McCaffrey averaged 30.1 fantasy points per game on the season last year, getting an average of 19.7 rush attempts per game and 6.3 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 19% owned, projected at 23.8 fantasy points here in week 1. He's $9,500 DraftKings salary, $900 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 44 points scored in this game, with the Panthers favored by 4.5. So not much else to say about Christian McCaffrey. He's a stud. He's got major upside every single game. So I like Christian McCaffrey here versus the New York Jets. But my favorite running back stud on the slate, who I think is underpriced and underowned, is Derrick Henry from the Tennessee Titans playing the Arizona Cardinals, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they're middle-of-the-pack defending opposing running backs. Derrick Henry averaged 22.8 fantasy points per game on the season last year, getting an average of 23.6 rush attempts per game and 1.9 pass targets per game. He's only going to be about 7% owned, projected at 21.5 fantasy points here in week 1. He's $8,800 DraftKings salary and only $100 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 52 points scored in this game, and they have the Titans favored by 3. Now, the Titans and the Cardinals were 2 of the fastest paced teams in the league last year. Derrick Henry gets a ton of rush attempts. He's got monster upside, and I think he's definitely underpriced and going to be under-owned this week in a high-scoring game. So I like Derrick Henry here versus the Arizona Cardinals. Now I also like James Robinson from the Jacksonville Jaguars playing the Houston Texans, who have the 3rd worst defense overall, and they give up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing running backs. James Robinson, he averaged 18.8 fantasy points per game on the season last year, getting an average of 17.1 rush attempts per game and 4.3 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 7% owned, projected at 16.1 fantasy points here in week 1. He's $6,400 DraftKings salary, and he's $500 less on FanDuel. So I like that FanDuel price. And Vegas thinks there's going to be 45.5 points scored in this game, with the Jaguars favored by 3.5. So fantastic matchup. I think his ownership is right about where it should be, but he's a solid mid-range play here. So I like James Robinson here versus the Houston Texans. Real quick guys, I got great news. For a limited time, we're offering a full 30-day trial to Draft Dashboard. You can try all the tools for NFL, MLB is still going, NBA is right around the corner. This is a great time to get in and try everything for 1 month. The tools are all about saving research time. You can see the last 3 games, the fantasy points per game, the targets they got per game, so you can see how involved they are in the offense, the rushes they got per game. Seeing all this stuff on one screen helps you save time and make better picks. Oh, and if you're tired of doing research every day, we just added a cheat sheet that shows hand-picked plays for the slate. No confusing stat lines, no headaches, just a simple cheat sheet that shows the absolute best players for your lineups. Okay, now if you want to come down in salary and come down in ownership, take a look at Raheem Mostert from the San Francisco 49ers playing the Detroit Lions, who had the worst defense overall last year, and they gave up the absolute most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Raheem Mostert, he averaged 12.6 fantasy points per game on the season last year, getting an average of 13 rush attempts per game and 2.4 pass targets per game. He's only going to be about 3% owned, projected at 12.8 fantasy points here in week 1. But I think he's going to score closer to 16 fantasy points or more, and he's $5,800 DraftKings salary and $300 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 45 points scored in this game, with the San Francisco 49ers favored by 8. So I like this pick because you're getting a low salary, low ownership, the best possible matchup on paper, and the San Francisco 49ers are favored by 8 in this game, so Raheem Mostert could get a ton of work in this one. So I like Raheem Mostert here versus the Detroit Lions. Okay, let's take a look at the wide receiver position. So yes, Devontae Adams, Tyreek Hill, both those guys are in great spots, but the wide receiver that I like the most on this slate here in week 1 is Calvin Ridley from the Atlanta Falcons playing the Philadelphia Eagles, who have the 11th worst defense overall, and they give up the 7th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Calvin Ridley averaged 20.4 fantasy points per game on the season last year, getting an average of 9.5 pass targets per game. Now he's going to be about 19% owned. He was on the field for 73% of the snaps last year, and I expect that number to go up. Remember, there's no Julio Jones now, so Calvin Ridley's volume should be increased. He should get a bigger target share. He's projected at 19.2 fantasy points here in week 1. He's $7,900 DraftKings salary and $200 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 48.5 points scored in this game, with the Falcons favored by 3.5. So you got a great matchup. Now, his ownership is way up there. He's going to be a popular play this week, but for good reason. So I like Calvin Ridley here versus the Philadelphia Eagles. Okay, another wide receiver that I like is Stefon Diggs from the Buffalo Bills playing the Pittsburgh Steelers, who had a good defense overall last year, and they were middle of the pack defending opposing wide receivers. Stefon Diggs averaged 21.9 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 10.4 pass targets per game. Now he's going to be about 16% owned, and he was on the field for 89% of the snaps last year. He's projected at 19.9 fantasy points here in week 1. He's $7,600 DraftKings salary and $300 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 48.5 points scored in this game, and they have the Bills favored by 6.5. So Stefon Diggs is one of the most explosive players in the league. He can make all his fantasy points up with 1 or 2 long bombs for touchdowns, and he gets a ton of pass targets every game. So I like Stefon Diggs here versus the Pittsburgh Steelers. Another wide receiver I like is Tyler Boyd from the Cincinnati Bengals playing the Minnesota Vikings, who have the 7th worst defense overall, and they give up the 4th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Tyler Boyd averaged 13.2 fantasy points per game on the season last year, getting an average of 7.3 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 8% owned, projected at 13 fantasy points here in week 1. He's only $5,200 DraftKings salary and $700 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 47 points scored in this game, and they have the Bengals trailing by 3. So you got a fantastic matchup here. And remember, there's no AJ Green, so Tyler Boyd is going to be the number 1 target with increased volume. So I like Tyler Boyd here versus the Minnesota Vikings. Okay, now probably one of the best value plays on the slate at the wide receiver position. Take a look at Marquez Callaway from the New Orleans Saints playing the Green Bay Packers, who had a good defense overall last year, and they were good defending the pass. But Marquez Callaway, he's only $3,400 DraftKings salary, $1,800 more on FanDuel. And you have to remember, there's no Michael Thomas. He's super cheap. He's going to get a ton of volume this game, or he should get a ton of volume this game as their probable number 1 target. I think the main thing is with this pick is that you're going to get a number 1 wide receiver who should get a bunch of pass targets, and his salary is super low. He's projected at 12 fantasy points here in week 1. Vegas thinks there's going to be 49 points scored in this game, with the Saints trailing by 3.5. So you got a pretty high scoring game with the Saints possibly falling behind, needing to pass the ball to catch up. I love this value play, so I like Marquez Callaway here versus the Green Bay Packers. Okay, moving on to the tight end position. Let's get this stud pick out of the way. I like Travis Kelce from the Kansas City Chiefs playing the Cleveland Browns, who had the 12th worst defense overall last year, and they give up the 4th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Travis Kelce averaged 22.1 fantasy points per game on the season last year, getting an average of 9.7 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 13% owned. He was on the field for 82% of the snaps, projected at 20.1 fantasy points here in week 1. He's $8,300 DraftKings salary, $200 more on FanDuel, and Vegas thinks there's going to be 54.5 points scored in this game, with the Kansas City Chiefs favored by 5.5. So it looks like the Kansas City Chiefs is going to be a good game to stack. Although their players are expensive, it's a high game total, and it's within a touchdown, so I don't think this game's going to be a blowout. It's a fantastic matchup for Kelce, so I like Travis Kelce here versus the Cleveland Browns. Okay, if you want a stud that you're going to save some salary on, then come down in ownership, take a look at George Kittle from the San Francisco 49ers playing the Detroit Lions, who had the worst defense overall last year, and they were middle of the pack defending opposing tight ends. George Kittle, he averaged 16.4 fantasy points per game on the season last year, getting an average of 7.9 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 9% owned, projected at 16.5 fantasy points here in week 1, and he's $6,300 DraftKings salary and $700 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 45 points scored in this game, with the 49ers favored by 8. But remember, the San Francisco 49ers have the 3rd highest team total on the slate at 26.5 points. So those points got to come from somewhere. I think it's going to be Raheem Mostert and George Kittle racking up those points. It's a fantastic matchup, and I think the salary and the ownership are pretty good on George Kittle as well. So I like George Kittle here versus the Detroit Lions. Another tight end that I like is Logan Thomas from the Washington football team playing the LA Chargers, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they give up the 8th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Logan Thomas averaged 11.2 fantasy points per game on the season last year, getting an average of 6.9 pass targets per game. Now, he scored 12, 13, and 13 fantasy points in his last 3 games off of 9, 6, and 12 pass targets. So those are great numbers, and he was on the field for 93% of the snaps. It's one of the reasons I really like this pick, and he's only going to be about 3% owned. So you're getting him at low ownership, and he's projected at 10.9 fantasy points here in week 1. He's $4,600 DraftKings salary and $1,000 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 44.5 points scored in this game, with the Washington football team favored by 1.5. So you got a close, competitive team, a good matchup, low ownership, and a guy who's on the field for 93% of the snaps. So I like Logan Thomas here versus the LA Chargers. And the other tight end that I like is Eric Ebron from the Pittsburgh Steelers playing the Buffalo Bills, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they give up the 7th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Eric Ebron averaged 9.5 fantasy points per game on the season last year, getting an average of 6.1 pass targets per game. But take a look at his last 2 games. He scored 19 and 16 fantasy points off of 11 and 7 pass targets. Now, he's only going to be about 1% owned. He was on the field for 70% of the snaps last year. He's projected at 7.4 fantasy points here in week 1, although I think he can score 10 fantasy points or more, and he's only $3,900 DraftKings salary. He's $1,300 more on FanDuel, and Vegas thinks there's going to be 48.5 points scored in this game, with the Steelers trailing by 6.5. So you got a great matchup in a game that the Steelers may have to pass the ball to catch up to the Buffalo Bills. So it could be a passing game script, super low ownership, and a guy that ended the season really well. So I like Eric Ebron here versus the Buffalo Bills.
If you want to try all these daily fantasy tools for yourself, click the link in the description below this video, or just go to draftdashboard.com. You can use our DFS lineup optimizer to build quality lineups using our picks and your own custom player pool. Click the link in the description below this video and try all these daily fantasy tools right now. Thanks so much for watching. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit that bell icon so you can get instant updates whenever we post a new video. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please smiggity smash that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Oh, and please comment below with your favorite player for this NFL slate. I love to hear what you guys have to think. Thanks again, and good luck.